thing we're going to tackle is it's already time to fit the lid. And this lid is going to be a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. And we'll lay it on here. And when you're sizing it, really the number one thing to keep in mind is that it needs to hang over this edge by about a 1/16 of an inch so that the lid will actually close. So you cut it to size and, you know, move it around until you can feel a 1/16 all around and then get it to its final trim size. And the thing we're going to do that might not be obvious right now is we're going to take a little piece of poplar, and it's called the dust skirt, and we're going to dovetail that around the edge of the lid to hide the plywood edges and also to provide that critical dust seal that protects our tools. But before we do that, there is one more thing I want to do to the lid, and I'm going to add a second panel. This is a 1/2 inch piece of shop grade birch, and we're going to just laminate it, just face glue it and put some nails in to hold it while it dries, this panel. And we're going to do this for a couple reasons. One, so that it looks right. A lot of tool chests would have this raised panel, and this would be a frame and panel construction. And so you might say, well, that's fakery, I'm not going to do that. Well, there's another really good reason to do that, and that is to reinforce the top. This top is 3/4 of an inch, which is pretty strong, but adding that extra 1/2 inch will make the top just bulletproof. You'll be able to dance on it once you add that little extra bit of panel to it. So it's worth the extra time, it's worth the extra effort, and it's really not all that much of either. So I'm going to set my combination square to 4 inches, which is how much the panel should be inset from the ends, just to give us a little guide. And we'll put it 4 inches back here. Just a rough guide. And make sure that fits in there. So it looks pretty good, not bad. I mean, we'll get to paint that. So if it's not perfect, it's not perfect. So we're just going to flip this over and apply glue liberally. This is no time to be a conservative. Okay. Drop it on there as close to the lines as I can. And if I had a pneumatic nailer, I would just pop a few 18 gauge brads in here, but this, you know, is so simple you don't really even need that. So I'm going to take one and put it right in the middle. This is a 3-penny nail, slipped on me. Nice. Okay, so I'm going to drive it in a little bit. And I'm going to drive it in a little bit at an angle because a 3-penny nail is almost too long for this operation. And then I'm going to, while the glue starts to set up, shift it into its final position, and then we'll, good. And then we can make sure from the center that it's squared up, and then just put a few more pins at the corners to keep things in place while the glue sets up. One back here. And it would be totally embarrassing if I nailed this to the bench. So stick around, find out. And that was close. Nothing came through. So I'm going to let this glue dry, and then I'm going to take either my block plane or a sanding block with some 120 grit and ease these corners. so that they're not sharp and don't catch on anything or get mutilated while we're continuing to work. So that's all we need to do for the lid, probably the easiest raised panel door in history. Now it's time to simply put on the hinges. So we're going to decide if we're going to use butt hinges or the really super easy piano hinge, and that's next. The first step to getting our lid in place on top of the chest is to attach our hinges to the case. We attach them to the case first, and then we mark their position on the lid. As I mentioned earlier, we have two choices. We can either use a piano hinge or a continuous hinge, and this is the easier one to install. If you want to install this, all you do is you center it on the case, screw it in place, and then you mark its position on the lid and do the same thing on the lid, and you're done. I'm going to go a little bit more traditional. These are home center hinges, butts that have leafs that are 3/4 of an inch wide. And so what that does for us is it means we will make a hinge mortise that is the same width as the thickness of our stock. So it's a real easy hinge mortise to make. You really do want to add a hinge mortise. I think the temptation on these is just to screw it and be done with it. But you know, this is the seal that protects your tools from the dust. So even that little hinge mortise will close up the back of the chest, keeping dust at bay. So what we're going to do now is we are going to make this hinge mortise. We're going to make 3 of them. I made one already, and this one is centered on the chest. And we're going to make one down here that starts 5 inches from the end here, and then over on the other end we're going to make one that I've already marked out that's 5 inches from the end. So I use the actual hinge to mark things out, and we're going to start on this one. And so I made a little mark at 5 inches in, and then I just lay the hinge on. This is much better than measuring. Then I just take any sort of knife, a pocket knife, a utility knife, an X-Acto, whatever you got, and just lay in the lines, and just take several gentle cuts at first to make a little track for the knife to follow. Most people try to do it all in one mighty stroke, and that pushes the hinge out of the way and the line wanders. So it's gentle strokes at first. So now I've got my 2 lines, and because none of our eyesight, our eyes are getting better as we get older, I'm going to run a little lead through there so I can see what I'm doing. Now I can chop that out with just a chisel and get in there and chop it all out and then come in and clean up the bottom. But if you have a router plane, and this is a small router plane designed for hinges such as this can make your life a lot easier because it's like a chisel with a depth stop. It's going to give you a consistent bottom for all of your hinge mortises, which will allow your hinges to sit in the same plane, which means your lid is much less likely to bind. So router planes, you don't have to buy a new fancy one like this. They're available on the secondary market, you know, very cheap. The Stanley 271 is a good example of that. So what I do is, the first thing I do is I set the depth of the iron. And the way I'm going to set the depth of the iron is use the actual hinge leaf. So I'm going to put the hinge leaf onto the bottom of my router plane, and I'm going to raise or lower the iron until it is exactly where the tip meets the top of the hinge leaf. And then I'm going to reach down here with my fingers and secure that iron, and it needs to be tapped a little bit more. A little too much. Bring it down. Perfect. Okay. And then always with any router plane, no matter who makes it, is you want to turn it over and screw the router plane iron in place. So now what I've done is not only have I set the depth as to where I want this hinge mortise to end up, but I also have a little marking knife here, and I can just use this to mark out my depth. So I'm going to take it and put it on the work, and you can stab in and drag the router plane a corner of the iron all the way across. And that way I don't have to like get out and measure, and this is where the line's going to end up. And I do it on both sides. So I'm going to do it on the side facing you and the side facing me, a couple deep stabs. And then I can put a line in there to, so I know where to stop when I'm chiseling. Now I can start chiseling right now, but if you have any sort of handsaw, doesn't matter what kind, you can break up a lot of the waste with the handsaw. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to saw first at the extents of my hinge until I hit the line here and I hit the line here. Then I'm going to come over here to the other extent of the hinge and saw down there. Till I hit the line here, and now I'm just going to bust up the waste in between, sawing down to the line. And the more work I do here, the less chiseling I'm going to have to do. And I'll tell you, the temptation is just to get the chisel and try to get that waste out of here, but this saves a lot of effort, especially when you're making hinge mortises in plywood, because plywood has, I'm going to be making a lot of cuts in end grain, because half of this is end grain. And end grain is no fun to chisel, and it's not so bad to saw. So I'm making lots of cuts, way more than I would in, if I were just using it in flat grain. All right, so that's pretty good. So now I'm going to take a chisel. This is just like a 1/2 inch chisel. Any sort of chisel, any width will do. It doesn't have to be 1/2 inch. And I'm just going to start busting up that waste. The first thing I do is I just drive down the center. And then I'll work my way out to the edges. I don't want to start at the edges because the tendency will be for the plywood to split out there if I get inside a lamination. So I just want to work my way from the center out, and these chops kind of make some relief for the next line of chops. And you can see some of the little bits working their way up now. And this is just all a way to make life easier for the router plane, because router planes don't take a big bite. They take little bites. And if you ask them to take a big bite, they just jam. My plane will probably jam a couple times. So I'm taking it easy as I chop this out here. And this is how I do it even at home or even on commission work when I build furniture for other people. I don't put a giant 3 1/4 horsepower router on an edge. That's just insane. So I've marked my bottom line there, so I know where I need to get to. So I am just going to take a small bite, a little less than a 1/16 with this router plane. So I adjusted the iron up, and I'm going to make one pass here. When you use a router plane, the real trick is to have one corner of the tool on your work that's not going to be cut, and then with your other hand pivot the iron into the work. So you're not just going to thrust forward, you're actually going to pivot. So I'm going to push in, and you can see how it just pulls that waste right up. So I'm pushing in from one side into the center, and now I'm going to come back the other way. So push here and pivot. I try to do half the hinge mortise here, and boy, when you do this in end grain, it sure looks ugly, so thank goodness that's going to be covered in a hinge. And now I'm going to pivot the other way back. So pressing down with my left hand against the carcass and pivoting with my right hand. Now all this talking, it really slows me down. This actually is a pretty fast process. Another option a lot of people will do here is they'll use a chisel to get really close to the baseline, the depth, the final depth, and then they'll come in and just clean the floor with the router plane. So I've made one pass here,
And now I'm going to set the router plane for the final depth. So all I do is I loosen the iron, and then I put the iron on the work, show it the line that it made before, drop it into that line, and then lock it at the final depth. So as long as I have that line, I can always get right back to it. So I've got that set. There's a couple areas I'm going to do a little more chopping to, just to make it a little easier to clean out the bottom, because like I said, when you're doing all this end grain, it's really recalcitrant, which means tough. All right, let's see if I can pull this out. There we go. Nice. So push down and pivot. And that's the final depth, so push down and pivot. So that's cleaning, that side of the mortise is cleaning out nicely. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side, push down and pivot. Okay. All right, just a little bit of waste here and there. Sometimes it's hard to get in the corners with the router plane, and it's good to just get in there with the chisel and clean things out. Okay. Now I can take my hinge and drop it in there and see how I did. Nice, airtight fit. So I can screw that one in place. I can screw this one in place. And now I just have to finish this hinge mortise, get all of these screwed in place, and then we're going to show these hinges screwed in place to the lid, and that's the next step. I've got two of our butt hinges screwed in here, and now I'm going to screw in the third one, and then we can transfer their location to the underside of the lid. So it goes in all nice like that. And the way I install these hinges is, the first thing I'm going to do is, there's a little opening on the back of the leaf here, and I'm going to flush that up with the edge of the case. So the back of the leaf, all the backs of the leaves of all three hinges are in the same plane. That's one of the things that makes a nice non-binding lid. Then I'm going to take mechanical pencil and just gently, while I'm pressing down the hinge, draw the outline of the screw hole, just so that if I move this hinge during this process, I can quickly get back to where I was. You can eventually, you'll probably get to the point where you can skip that step, but when you're first installing hinges, it's a good pointer. The next thing I'll do is I'll take an awl and create a starter hole. This is a birdcage awl, which means it has a four-pointed tip, which I like because it allows you to steer your hole, so I can steer it into the center, because I can just rotate it a little more in the direction I want it to go. And so I just try to get a starter hole right in the center of each of these. And we'll get that one in there. Now these little screws that go in there, these aren't probably what I would be my first choice if this were a piece of fine furniture. They're a little small, and they're also Phillips head, which don't look right on a traditional chest, but you know, hey, that's what came with it, so that's what we'll install. So I have a 1/16 inch drill bit installed into the chuck, and that extends out about the same length as my length of my screw. So now I can just drop this into the hole I created and drill down. Some people like all the fancy center punches and everything to drill these holes. I've never found it really necessary. I've tried them and I don't really dig them. So now I'm going to get this screw in place and almost pressing down against the leaf, and then put in a couple more so that it doesn't rotate out of location if there's any sloppiness between my hinge mortise and my hinge. And there's not really, but this is just good habit. And then I'll do the final tightening once they're, oh, that's nasty. Surprise, a cheap screw in a home center hinge. That never happens. So go in there. And I generally drive screws by hand for hardware. I mean, if you're doing production work, maybe you're good enough to use a screw gun, but it's also an easy way to strip these out. So then I just get them down to their final position. And we're done. So I'm going to shut all of the hinges, and now we're going to take the lid. You can see, looks the same as we did, earlier when we had this nailed on. And what Ty and I are going to do here is we're going to get it so that what's really important is that there's a little bit of overhang all the way around, so we can feel, it doesn't have to be completely consistent, but it just has to be a little bit of overhang. And so I'm just feeling, and then when I do this, I'm going to have Ty hold the thing down so that if it shifts, it's his fault. All right. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to hold something up here that's square, just to make sure that these are in line at the back, which looks good. So now here comes the most critical part of this process. And if you do it right, then the installation will be easy. And if things shift, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. So I have a knife. You can use your utility knife. You can use almost any knife. An X-Acto knife is a great choice. And what I want to do is, while this is pressed down, I want to get in here with the knife, and I just want to nick that corner where the leaf is. I don't want to nick the barrel where the barrel is, because this barrel sticks out. So I'm just pushing the tip up against the leaf and giving myself a nice little mark so that I can get back to that when I remove this lid. And so we're just going to do this all along and just make sure that nothing moves the whole time. Okay. Push. And okay, looks good. So now we can remove the lid, and we will turn it over. And now I will mark out, just like we did before, the location of the hinge mortises, and then use the chisel, and if I have a router plane, the router plane to make exactly the same hinge mortises on all three of these, and then attach these hinges, 1, 2, 3, in there, and then everything should be fine. So I'm going to do that, and then the next thing we're going to do, after we get the lid put on, is we're going to add the dust skirt. And the dust skirt is simply a 1 1/4 wide piece of poplar, in this case, that skirts all the way around the lid, sealing out the dust and providing a nice finished look to the chest. And you can, if you like, simply glue and screw with butt joints this dust seal, just like we did this top skirt and this lower skirt. But I'm going to show you how to use a single dovetail up here at each corner, which is a real easy way to get into dovetailing. It's really fast, and it's a nice look to have that dovetail right up at the corner. So that's where we're going next, as soon as we move the bench in place. Okay.